Staff Sergeant Cole was chewing his toothpick so hard it was about to snap. The dry wood cracked between his molars like a small gunshot inside the armored cab of the lead truck. Humid jungle air pushed through the open vents, carrying diesel, wet leaves, and the sour stink of men who had been packed too long inside hot steel. I kept my head down over Mitchell's arm and pressed the clear tape over the fresh needle site, smoothing it with my thumb until I felt the edge seal. The IV tubing was cool against my glove. Blood had already ribboned into the line in thin red threads. Mitchell watched my hands like they belonged to somebody who might still get him out of this morning alive. "Porter, I don't care what your orders say. You're the only corpsman we've got, and you're riding exposed in the lead truck. That's not how we do it." I looked up just enough to meet Cole's eyes. He sat in the front passenger seat with one shoulder turned toward me, broad back filling half the cab, doctrine wrapped around him tighter than his plate carrier. His voice stayed controlled. That was the thing about him. He wasn't stupid, and he wasn't grandstanding. He was trying to keep the convoy inside the neat little box the manual promised would protect everybody. Manuals were adorable that way. My fingers stayed on Mitchell's arm, pressing the tape down over the line while I watched the small, involuntary flutter hit his left eye. Fear, trying to hide under bravado. Same twitch, same place, same ugly memory. Reyes had done that right before the last op went sideways, and 3 seconds turned into a body bag. "Respectfully, Sergeant, my orders come from higher than you. Keep me in the lead truck." I said it flat. No rise in my voice, no heat. Mitchell went still. Cole's jaw tightened another notch, and the toothpick splintered with a sharp pop. For a second, nobody moved. The engine growled under us. Heat rolled through the cab. The driver kept both hands welded to the wheel, while the jungle slid by outside in wet green walls. I checked the drip chamber again by reflex, still running. Good. Cole half turned like he wanted to push the point, then stopped when the first sound hit, a tearing shriek ripping through the engine noise and straight through thought. The RPG punched through the windshield 2 feet left of my head. Glass exploded inward in a glittering cloud that stung my cheeks and skated across my sleeves. The convoy lurched hard left, tires screaming against the narrow jungle track. Marines yelled, "Contact left!" while the whole truck shuddered like something giant had taken a swing at it. My hands moved before thought. One hand clamped over Mitchell's forearm before the jolt could tear the fresh line loose. The other braced against the seat frame as the truck fishtailed, and somebody up front cursed hard enough to scrape blood off the word. More shattered safety glass came in, bouncing off my collar and ticking across the floor like sleet on sheet metal. Mitchell sucked air through his teeth, not from the needle, from the gunfire waking up outside. That fast, ugly rip in the trees. His left eye jumped again. Reyes all over again. Same hidden panic. Same dumb young man effort to wear it like a joke. I felt the memory hit low and hot, then shoved it back where it belonged. Dead men could wait. The living one in front of me could not. I pressed the tape one last time, hard enough to feel the plastic bite through my glove, and kept the line alive while the ambush ripped the morning open. My left hand was already planted on the driver's head before I registered why it felt so slick. Scalp wound. Glass did that. It looked catastrophic. Bled like murder. Usually wasn't. My right hand stayed on Mitchell's arm, pinning the fresh IV in place while the truck shuddered under another burst from the tree line. Blood ran hot between my fingers. Shattered safety glass glittered across the dash and floorboards, and the open windshield fed the cab a hard mix of wet heat, burnt propellant, and jungle rot. Somebody behind us was shouting for suppressive fire. Somebody else was screaming for his mother, which was never a great sign. I leaned harder into the pressure dressing with one hand, locked the IV line with the other, and brought the hidden radio up from the false bottom of my med bag. Static chewed the channel the second I keyed it live. I didn't raise my voice, didn't explain, didn't ask. Sierra Tango 4, Phantom 79er, Emergency Auth Delta, Whiskey 37, Echo, Hot LZ, Request Immediate C, AS, and Extract. The cab went strangely small after that. Not quieter, just smaller. Like the code itself had taken up all the available air. The driver was breathing in short animal bursts under my palm, trying to keep the truck straight while his own blood sheeted down his cheek and over the collar of his vest. "Stay with the road," I told him. "Bleeding looks worse than it is." Maybe true. Maybe just useful. Mitchell was swearing through clenched teeth, trying not to yank free from the line every time the tires slammed a rut. The IV still held. I checked the flow by feel, not sight. The tubing was tacky with blood, where the blast had thrown him sideways, and the plastic felt cool against my knuckles in a cab that had turned oven hot in under 5 seconds. Cole twisted around in his seat and stared at the radio in my hand first, then at me, then back at the radio like it might suddenly become harmless if he looked hard enough. No doctrine speech now, no wasted breath. Just the slow recalculation of a man realizing the quiet corpsman in his lead truck had access to a channel he was never supposed to hear. Good. Let him catch up later. Outside, PKM fire hammered the armor in ugly metallic bursts, steady enough to sound like somebody punching holes through doctrine, one sentence at a time. The encrypted line hissed in my ear, searching, handshaking, deciding whether the voice on the other end belonged in its world. Those were the longest seconds, not because I was afraid it would fail, but because I knew exactly what success would cost. Cole would log this. He had to. Any smart NCO with a career and a pulse would. Timestamp, unauthorized net access, emergency override in a live kill zone, audit bait from hell. The system always sent the bill after the shooting stopped. That didn't change the math now. The driver grunted and nearly lost the wheel. I shoved the dressing down harder until he hissed through his teeth and found the road again. Mitchell looked at me with that same left eye twitch, except the fear had shifted. A minute ago, he'd been scared of dying. Now he was scared of not understanding the person sitting beside him. Fine. Understanding was a luxury item. Survival came first. The reply came back in under 5 seconds. Clean, immediate, professional. Not confusion, not challenge. Recognition. The voice on the encrypted channel snapped into my ear with the kind of authority that made the whole truck seem to lean toward it. Cole heard enough from my side of the exchange to know this wasn't bluff, theater, or some lucky grab at a dead man's handset. Cover burned, gone for good. Whatever soft little fiction had kept me acceptable in his truck had just been blown out with the windshield. He looked at me like he was seeing 2 people overlaid in the same seat, the medic and the operator, and he hated that he hadn't noticed the seam sooner. Fair enough. I kept pressure on the driver's head, kept Mitchell's line alive, and listened to the inbound acknowledgement, while the kill zone kept trying to chew the convoy apart around us. Blood warmed my fingers. Static scratched my ear. The taste of iron sat thick on my tongue. Somewhere ahead, deeper in the trees, the enemy gun found its rhythm again. The first timestamp was locked now. So was everything that came after. The voice in my ear was still finishing the acknowledgement when I pulled my hand off the driver's head and shoved the pressure dressing into Cole's grip. "Keep that there," I said, already moving. He took it without arguing. That was new. Mitchell was halfway down the bench, glass in his lap, face washed white under the dirt. The first thing I saw was the wet arterial pulse kicking out of the inside of his thigh, in short, violent bursts, bright enough to look fake in the green half-light pouring through the ruined windshield. Femoral bleed. That jumped every other problem in the truck and took the top slot. I dropped to him, ripped the CAT tourniquet free from my kit, and got it high around his leg one-handed, while my other hand kept his weight from folding the wrong way. The strap bit in, flesh compressed. Muscle jumped hard under my knuckles. Mitchell made a strangled sound and tried to jerk back. I locked him with my forearm and leaned in close enough for him to hear me through the gunfire. "Hold still, kid. I've fixed worse before breakfast." He stared at me like I had reached in and squeezed the panic out by hand. Outside, the PKM kept hammering. Inside, nobody spoke, not even Cole. The tourniquet bit deeper as I cinched it down, and the bleed changed under my palm. Less rhythm, less force, more ugly seep than open faucet. Good enough for now. Good enough was sacred in kill zones. Mitchell's jaw worked twice before he found words. "Ma'am, I am never talking back to you again. It would have been funny anywhere else. Here, it sounded like religion." I checked the line in his arm, saw the IV still running, then shoved him toward the broken door. "You can show your devotion by staying conscious." He actually nodded. Cole was still crouched, half inside the cab, one hand buried in the driver's blood-soaked dressing, the other braced on the frame, mouth hanging open a fraction too long to be dignified. Not fear. Recognition. The slow jaw drop of a man watching a private category fail in real time. He had thought he had a stubborn corpsman with bad timing. What he had was something else, and every second of this fight kept making it harder to pretend otherwise. The jungle hit like a hot, wet slap the second I jumped down from the truck. Mud sucked at my boots. Cordite and churned leaves sat thick in the air, layered over diesel smoke and the copper stink of too much blood in one place. Marines were stacked in ugly little shapes behind wheels, axles, whatever steel they could find, firing blind toward the tree line every time the PKM chewed another line through the convoy. I grabbed Mitchell under the plate carrier strap and hauled him toward the shadow on the far side of the truck, while he bit down on whatever curse he had left. The CAT held. I could feel the pressure of it, even through the drag of his weight, like the whole leg had turned into one rigid protest. Somebody reached to help and I snapped. "Take his shoulders. Don't touch the leg." They obeyed before they could think about who I was to tell them. That was the shift right there. Not respect. Not yet. Velocity. Competence moving faster than custom. I yanked the IR strobe from my kit, thumbed it live, and hurled it past the ditch toward the patch of broken ground that gave us the cleanest shot at a landing zone. The little device vanished into smoke and brush, then answered with a pulse I couldn't quite see straight on, only catch in the edge of things, a ghost flash beating through the green, infrared for the birds, almost invisible to us. But I knew where it was, and so would they. The convoy had a mark. The fight had a shape. Mitchell grabbed my sleeve before I could turn away, fingers shaking, pain all over him, and devotion tucked under it like new religion. "Doc," he said, rough and urgent, "I'm with you." I peeled his hand off and shoved a magazine into the Marine next to him instead. "Then stay breathing." Above the rifles and shouted corrections, a new sound started building beyond the canopy. Rotor thump. Faint at first, then meaner, closer. The kind of promise that always came with paperwork and body bags both. Cole heard it too. His face went tight in a whole different way. I checked the strobe pulse one more time through the smoke, tasted iron, and knew the air war had just been invited into our mess. The PKM was still working the convoy like a jackhammer when I vaulted back through the broken truck. You could hear the difference between panic fire and a gun run by somebody who knew exactly where to hurt you. This one had rhythm. It was chewing low, raking wheel wells, engine blocks, knees. Every burst forced another Marine flatter into the mud. Cordite rolled through the wrecked cab, bitter and hot, mixing with blood and burned glass. I went over the bench instead of around it, boots slipping on shattered safety glass, shoulder clipping the seat frame hard enough to spark pain down my scarred arm. No time for elegance. The lance corporal had gone down between the second and third truck, caught in the open, where the PKM could keep everybody honest. He was dragging one leg and not getting anywhere. I hooked my medbag, dropped low, and cut across the gap when the nearest Marine team dumped a burst into the tree line. Gun left. 50 yards. Low in the brush. I snapped. Walk it right to left. Make him blink. Somebody answered with a clipped, "Aye," and the return fire thickened. Good. Noise was currency. I meant to spend every round of theirs I could buy. The wounded Marine had managed maybe 6 feet before mud and blood turned him into dead weight. I slid in, caught the back of his carrier, and dragged him behind the axle of the lead truck, while bark, dirt, and pieces of leaf kept kicking off the ground around us. He was trying to help, which was thoughtful and stupid, and mostly just made him heavier. "Save the hero act," I told him. "Use your elbows." He did. The PKM hammered again, so close that I felt the rounds in my ribs through the truck body. Above us, somebody's rifle cracked in disciplined 3-round bursts. Cole's people were settling into my cadence whether they liked it or not. I popped the false bottom of the med bag with one hand and pulled the M4 free from the compartment, black metal warm from being trapped against my kit and my body heat. The weapon landed in my grip like it had been waiting there all morning, which, fair enough, it had. Cole saw it from the far side of the hood. I watched the realization hit him in stages. Corpsman, radio, tourniquet, hidden rifle. By then, he was past outrage and into adaptation. "You heard her," he barked to his Marines. "Suppress left tree line. Keep that bastard pinned." That was as close to surrender as a Marine Staff Sergeant was ever going to get. And under the circumstances, it counted as poetry. The tree line looked close until I had to cross toward it. Then it stretched. Smoke drifted low over the ditch. Wet heat pressed down like a hand on the back of my neck. The jungle floor was slick with rotting leaves and torn roots, and the kind of mud that wanted to keep a boot once it had it. I moved in short, ugly bursts, using wrecked metal, a split drainage culvert, one blown tire still wobbling on its rim. The PKM chopped overhead again and sheared bark off a trunk so near my face it peppered my cheek with pulp. I dropped, came up under the next fold in the ground, and yelled back, "Shift fire, 10 yards left. Keep him talking." A Marine echoed it. Another answered with grenadier thumps farther down the line. Good men? Fast learners? The M4 sat tight in my shoulder as I checked the edge of the brush and built the angle in my head. Whoever was running that PKM had discipline, but discipline could still be manipulated. Make him commit. Make him chase noise. Make him believe the convoy was still begging for mercy while one quiet problem moved under all that racket toward his flank. Then the radio crackled with the confirmation I had been waiting for. Hot extract. 12-minute extraction window, now active. That clock changed everything. Not because it gave us hope, because it gave us terms. 12 minutes to keep the landing zone viable. 12 minutes to stop that PKM from sawing the convoy in half. 12 minutes before the sky arrived, mean and loud and visible to every bastard within range. I thumbed the selector, checked the lane one more time, and looked back just long enough to see the IR strobe pulsing through smoke like a bad heartbeat. Cole was moving men where I needed them, without waiting to be convinced. Mitchell was propped behind cover, pale and furious, rifle up across his good leg, eyes locked on me like I was the answer key to a test he hadn't studied for. Fine, let them watch later. Right then I needed them shooting. "On my move," I shouted. 2 teams pinned the gun. Don't chase, don't get greedy. A chorus of short acknowledgments came back through the din. No speeches, no drama, just work. The PKM barked again, and I broke from cover, cutting for the dark seam in the trees, with the M4 tucked close, cordite thick in my nose, mud cold on my shins, and 12 minutes, starting to count my life out in hard, mechanical clicks. The real fight began when I hit the brush. I hit the brush, and the world shrank to muzzle flash. The PKM nest was lower than it sounded from the road, dug into a damp fold of ground behind a screen of broad leaves and rotting roots. Smart placement, mean placement, Just enough elevation to rake the convoy without showing too much of itself. I caught the first gunner in the strobe white bite of his own flash and fired before my brain finished labeling him. 2 rounds center chest, a third higher when he stayed in the fight. He folded backward into the gun like somebody had cut his strings. The second man in the pit jerked hard, trying to swing the PKM off its arc, and I threw myself sideways behind a slick root ball while dirt spat over my neck and collar. Wet leaves plastered against my cheek. Mud climbed into my sleeves. The air in there was hot enough to chew, all burned powder and green rot and old standing water. Behind me, the convoy was still firing into the tree line, but thinner now, more controlled. They had heard the shift. They knew the gun had changed tone. Good. That bought me 1 breath, maybe 2. I took both, then moved again before the nest could settle on my last position. The pit had been built by someone patient. Sandbags half buried under brush, spent links in the muck, a spare belt draped over an ammo crate wrapped in a torn poncho. That told me almost as much as the firing pattern had. Not amateurs. Not one lucky team with a stolen gun. Men who expected to stay long enough to own this patch of jungle. The assistant gunner rose with an AK, caught movement, and fired too high, because people always did under pressure. I came up under his line and put 2 rounds center chest. He staggered, but did not drop. Armor or adrenaline or pure refusal. Didn't matter. The 3rd round took him through the face and shut the question down. For half a second, there was only ringing, leaves drifting, the smell of opened earth and blood. Then a voice barked from deeper in the brush, and another fighter tried to break right, using the dead gun pit for cover. I went low, slid on one knee through mud, and caught the angle before he did. He fired wild. I did not. The M4 bucked 3 times against my shoulder, and his body hit the lip of the nest hard enough to bounce. Somewhere to my left, a wounded man moaned once, short and shocked, and then stopped. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth, but the rest of me had gone cold, clinical, ugly, in the useful way. I got both hands on the PKM and understood immediately why crews loved it and everybody else respected it from a distance. The thing was heavy in the arms, filthy hot along the receiver, and mean with recoil even before I shouldered it properly. I hauled it around by the top cover and saw movement in the brush line beyond the nest, shadows trying to pull back, trying to decide whether this had turned into retreat or cleanup. I did not give them time to pick. I leaned into the stock, braced the weight into my shoulder pocket, and walked the fire across the undergrowth in short, savage sweeps. Not spray and pray, deliberate violence. The recoil hit like an animal trying to climb inside my collarbone. Every burst shoved me half a step offline, and I dragged it back. Muzzle flash, shredding leaves, branches, smoke, all of it. One man pitched backward through a fan of torn greenery. Another vanished behind a trunk and did not come back out. The PKM roared until the pit, the brush, the whole damp little pocket of jungle felt flayed open. When I let off, the silence was wrong for a second. Not true silence, just that stunned slack space after overwhelming noise, when your ears are still lying to you and your bones think they're being shot at a half second behind real time. Then the adrenaline drained. Not all at once. Worse than that. In layers. First, the hard edge came off my vision. Then the weight of the PKM doubled in my hands. Then Reyes showed up like he always did. Not as a ghost. Nothing that dramatic. Just a memory with teeth. 3 seconds of waiting on cover that never came. His blood soaking into gravel. The way my hand had slipped on him because I had been too late and trying too hard at the same time. My right hand started to tremble around the pistol grip before I could stop it. Small at first, then ugly. The barrel dipped and quivered against the churned leaves. I hated that part more than the killing, more than the noise, more than the look people got when they realized competence came with a crack down the middle. Rotor thump rolled over the canopy, distant but closing. And the sound should have steadied me. It didn't. I set the PKM down before the shaking made a fool out of me, flexed my fingers once, twice, and watched them fail to obey cleanly. The nest was dead. The convoy had a chance. My hand kept trembling anyway. The Blackhawks announced themselves before I saw them. Rotor thump rolled over the jungle in heavy pulses that pressed through the trees and into the ribs, turning the air mean. I was still kneeling in the ruined PKM nest with my right hand trembling against my thigh, trying to bully it into stillness by glaring at it like that had ever worked. It hadn't. Never did. I slung the M4, let the PKM hang where it was, and started back toward the landing zone, while the downdraft hit the upper canopy and shook loose dead leaves, dust, and old heat. By the time I broke out of the brush, the convoy looked half buried in its own smoke. The IR strobe was still pulsing through it like a sick heartbeat. Marines crouched behind trucks with their mouths open, yelling things no one could hear anymore. The rotor wash stripped the words right off them. Dirt whipped across my face hard enough to sting. My sleeves snapped against my arms. Burned cordite, diesel, and churned mud all got beaten flat into one rough taste on the back of my tongue. Somebody pointed at the sky and somebody else ducked like the helicopters might clip the treetops and come apart on top of us. I kept moving. Fight was over. Physics wasn't. Extraction always arrived like a second ambush. Just friendlier uniforms and more paperwork. Cole found me halfway to the marked patch of ground. He was bent into the wind, with one forearm shielding his face, tablet clutched in the other hand, like it might blow away and take his career with it. The driver had a field dressing wrapped hard around his head now, and Mitchell was alive, pale, pissed off, and glaring at the world from behind a wheel well, which counted as a good outcome in this business. Cole's eyes cut to my hand first. He saw the tremor. Then he looked away, which was the most polite thing he had done for me all day. Respect and suspicion sat on his face together, awkward as hell, neither willing to give the other room. He shoved the tablet at me, angling the screen against the glare. Black text washed in sunlight. A screenshot. JAG Memo header. Unlawful command influence in fat bureaucratic certainty across the top. Exactly the kind of thing nobody wanted anywhere near a live kill zone. "You seeing this?" he shouted. I only caught half of it through the rotor noise, but I didn't need more. His thumb stabbed at the upper corner of the screen where a timestamp sat wrong somehow, off just enough to itch. Not proof yet, just a burr under the skin. The kind that turned into infection if you ignored it. Cole's jaw moved once. "I'm logging my objection," he said. "I'm not eating this for free. Fair. Smart men documented disasters, while the dust was still airborne. The first Black Hawk dropped lower, and the downdraft turned vicious. It ripped ponchos loose, snapped branches, drove grit into every cut and exposed patch of skin. The landing zone flattened under the force of it, smoke smearing sideways, loose brass skipping across the mud like little gold insects. Marines started moving their wounded on muscle memory and bad knees. I reached up, thumbed the selector on the M4 to safe, and felt the small, clean click through my hand even with the tremor still trying to live there. That mattered. Little rituals mattered when the rest of the day had gone sideways. Cole saw the motion, saw the discipline in it, and that complicated his face again. He wanted me categorized. Corpsman, operator, problem, asset, pick one. Life kept insisting I be several inconvenient things at once. "We'll talk on the bird," I told him. The words came out flat, not angry, not friendly, just the next piece of work. He nodded once, then bent over the tablet again, using his body to shield the screen while he thumbed in the protest log. I caught flashes of the memo header between his hands, that same ugly line about command influence, and beneath it, the screenshot timestamp that didn't belong where it belonged. Something in the administrative bloodstream had already gone septic. Great. Because surviving the ambush apparently wasn't enough entertainment for one morning. The crew chief on the nearest bird was already waving us in with that violent, impatient circle of the arm people used when they assumed you either understood or deserved what happened next. I helped drag the wounded lance corporal through the mud, then grabbed the rear of Mitchell's carrier when his good leg slipped and the bad one threatened to fold. He cursed me, the helicopter, the jungle, maybe God too. Sounded healthy enough. Rotor wash hammered us flat all the way in. The world was noise and grit and metal and effort. No graceful rescue, no clean movie landing. Just bodies shoved uphill into a machine that smelled like hydraulic fluid, sweat, and old fear. I got one boot on the ramp and looked back in time to see Cole still outside for a beat, tablet up under his chest, staring at the screen as if the black letters might rearrange themselves into mercy. They didn't. He climbed aboard with the objection log saved, and the memo screenshot still burned into his eyes. The bird lifted under us, hard and immediate, and I knew before the tree line dropped away that the audit was coming. The first fight had ended. The internal one had just found its paperwork. The cabin door slammed shut, and the world turned into vibration. Black Hawk noise was never just sound. It lived in the teeth, the ribs, the bolts in the floor, the headset pressing hot against the side of the skull. JP-8 rode the air thick and bitter, mixed with blood, wet canvas, hydraulic fluid, and the acid stink of men trying not to look hurt in front of each other. I sat on the web bench with my knees braced wide and my right hand tucked under my left forearm, where nobody could see the last little tremor living there. Mitchell was strapped 2 seats down, pale as printer paper, jaw set hard around pain. Cole had finally stopped trying to categorize me and moved on to watching everything like it might testify later. Across from me, Lieutenant Commander Evan Harrison leaned in through the chop and the wash of red cabin light, calm in the ugly way only certain operators ever managed. Not relaxed, just expensive. His headset crackled once, then his voice cut through the cabin noise like a clean blade. Cole says you saw the memo screenshot before Wheels Up. He didn't waste time asking whether I was all right. That alone made me trust him a little. People who knew the work skipped fake concern and went straight to the leak. I took Cole's tablet when he shoved it across the gap and thumbed away a screen full of dust, blood, and cracked glare until the JAG memo screenshot settled into view again. Unlawful command influence. Ugly words. Useful words. If you wanted to box somebody into the wrong decision before they even knew they were in a fight, Harrison watched my face, not the screen. Good habit. Better than staring at pixels and pretending that counted as analysis. Talk me through it, he said, over the headset. I toggled the mission routing overlay, then dragged in the movement log from convoy dispatch. The bird banked and the floor thrummed up through my boots. JP-8 stung the back of my throat. Somebody farther forward gagged into a bag with the dedicated misery of a man losing a fight to motion sickness. I pulled in the air tasking note generated off my emergency auth call and lined the 3 data trails up. 3 clocks, 3 pathways, 1 lie buried inside them. The radio hissed in my ear while Harrison leaned closer, eyes narrowed, and the pattern clicked into place with the same ugly certainty I had felt in the tree line. Not chance, not simple betrayal. Cleaner than that. Worse than that. Something procedural. Something designed to survive audits by looking exactly like normal bureaucracy. I tapped the routing table and held it where Harrison could see, despite the cabin shake. Screen glare fought me, black text flaring silver, every time the bird rolled. The routing table doesn't lie, Commander. Someone moved us into the kill zone on paper before we even hit the road. Harrison went still in that dangerous way smart men did when the answer got uglier instead of cleaner. Cole swore under his breath. Not loud, not theatrical. Just the sound a doctrine man made when he realized the rules had been used as a weapon. Harrison took the tablet, compared the route line against the departure stamp, then against the convoy notification chain. The mismatch was only minutes, but it was enough. The road reassignment had been entered before final wheels-out approval, then backfilled to look legitimate. Somebody upstream had nudged the convoy into that corridor early in the system, letting the ambush cell know where we'd be while leaving just enough administrative fog to call it coincidence later. "Not insurgent luck," Harrison said. "Not a local asset guessing right." I shook my head. "No, this is a leak with a badge and a login." Harrison handed the tablet back and made the decision before anyone else in that cabin could pretend there was room for softer interpretations. "We run this as a procedural compromise, not a field betrayal. Mixed element. Need to know only. No wide distro." Cole looked like he wanted to argue, then didn't. He had seen enough of the day to know when the universe had stopped caring about his preferences. Harrison started assigning pieces through the headset, clipped and measured, pulling from NSW, Air Liaison, and the least contaminated slice of the marine chain he thought he could trust. A temporary team built in turbulence and jet fuel stink, held together by suspicion and the fact we were already too deep to walk away clean. I watched the routing data one more time while the helicopter banked north and the jungle slid beneath us in dark green folds. The mismatch kept staring back like a fingerprint on glass nobody else had noticed until now. Not one trader handing over maps in a parking lot. Not some movie villain with a thumb drive and a confession. A system leak. Higher than the road, colder than the ambush, patient enough to move units with paperwork and let other men do the bleeding. Harrison's voice crackled in my ear again, already turning us toward the next hit. Outside, the rotors kept chopping the sky to pieces. Inside, the truth settled in hard and cold. The insurgents were not the only ones who had known where to find us. By afternoon, the jungle had traded morning steam for a harder heat, the kind that sat on the shoulders and made every plate carrier feel lined with wet sand. The compound looked abandoned from a distance, which in my line of work usually meant two things. Somebody wanted it to look that way, and somebody was waiting for you to believe it. We came in low through a ragged stand of bamboo and deadfall. Harrison's mixed element stretched thin by urgency, and thinner still by trust. The routing table leak had pointed us here, to a hidden stinger cache moving through a former advisory channel that should have died years ago, and apparently hadn't. My medkit felt insultingly light. We had burned through more supplies on the road than anyone liked admitting. 2 decompression needles left, 1 half-crushed pressure bandage, not enough seal packs, never enough morphine. Ahead of me, a marine breacher raised 2 fingers and cut toward the outer wall while leaf litter popped under our boots in dry little snaps that sounded too loud in the hush. Then the compound woke up all at once. Fire cracked from the left corner tower. Splinters jumped off a timber post by my face. Somebody behind me dropped with a strangled grunt and hit the dirt, trying to breathe around a chest that had forgotten how. The first thing I heard over the gunfire was the wet wrong panic in that breathing. I slid to him on one knee while rounds punched leaves into confetti overhead. His eyes were huge. One side of his chest lagged, breath stacked high and shallow, every inhale smaller than the last. Tension pneumo, fast enough to kill, common enough to be cruel. I had one knee in mud, one boot braced against a root, and one hand already fishing for the needle while the other kept his vest clear and his shoulder from rolling wrong. No classroom, no lecture. No clean hospital light, just dirt, noise, and a ribcage trying to become a coffin. "Stay with me," I snapped. Not because it was original, but because old words sometimes kept people anchored. Bullets clipped dead leaves above us, each hit making a tearing sound like paper ripping beside the ear. I found the space by feel, committed, and drove the needle in one-handed, while my support hand kept him from twisting away. Resistance. Then, that ugly little give. Air escaped with a sharp, angry hiss, and his next breath stumbled in deeper. Still bad, but no longer final. Good enough for now. Behind me, Harrison was yelling movement commands through the radio while the breacher team answered with 3 controlled bursts and a flashbang that kicked white light through the courtyard. My patient grabbed my sleeve like he meant to hold on to the whole war with it. I peeled him loose and shoved him toward cover. Breathe first. Thank me later. The ex-US advisor showed himself in fragments before I got the full picture. Good footwork, smart angles, short controlled fire from places our own training would have favored. He moved like someone who had once stood on the same side of the glass as us and then decided history was negotiable if the price was right. I caught his silhouette through a blown doorway. Broad shoulders, headset wire, rifle tucked in clean and close, and he cut left the same second I did because he knew exactly how I would try to flank that room. Mirror problem. Hate those. He drove 2 fighters across the interior hall to pin our entry team while he peeled toward a side office with a field tablet jammed under one arm. Not just guarding weapons then, carrying something. Data or routing keys, or both. I fired first when he reappeared in the doorway. 2 rounds hit the man beside him center chest. The third went higher when body armor kept the first pair from finishing the work. The advisor vanished back into shadow before I could transition cleanly. More rounds, shredded plaster, and wooden shelving inside, filling the air with chalk, cordite, and that fried electric smell old compounds got when wires were cut under load. Somebody deeper in the cache touched off a cook line or demolition primer. Heat rolled down the corridor. Harrison shouted to collapse the west room and keep the launch tubes from walking. We were winning the compound and losing the clean version of the plan. We torched the cache because by then there wasn't a cleaner choice left. Stinger crates cooked off in ugly, staggered thumps. Not one giant movie fireball, but a series of brutal, contained concussions that shook dust from the rafters and sent black smoke pumping out through the roof seams. The advisor used that moment exactly the way I would have. Of course he did. He cut through the rear tree line under the cover of his own collapsing operation, dragging one surviving runner and the tablet package with him. I caught a final glimpse of him between the palms, head low, body angled, disciplined even in retreat. I put rounds after him and saw bark jump, not flesh. Too far, too much smoke, too much chaos. He was gone before I got a second lane. Around me, the compound sounded like a filing cabinet full of grenades and bad decisions. The Marine I decompressed was still breathing, thin but steady, propped against the wall with a rifle across his lap, and shock making his smile look drunk. Harrison moved through the smoke, counting heads, tubes, and what we had denied versus what had slipped the net. Partial intel lost. Enough destroyed to matter. Enough escaped to make tomorrow uglier. I stood in the wrecked doorway with the M4 hot in my hands and the last of my medical gear rattling in a kit that had turned almost empty, listening to the burning cache spit fragments into the afternoon. Somewhere beyond that smoke, an American-trained ghost was disappearing into the jungle with data that could still kill us. By evening, the jungle had gone darker without getting any cooler. Heat still hung under the trees, but now it carried a wet mineral smell from the creek bed and the sweeter, fouler scent of crushed plants baking down into rot. We tracked the advisor to an old extraction point cut into the bank decades earlier. Nothing left but a concrete pad, cracked by roots, and a rusted fuel drum lying on its side like some dead machine part. He had chosen the place well. 2 narrow approaches, tree cover behind him, open lane in front for anybody dumb enough to rush. I crouched behind a fallen trunk, with Harrison on my left and Cole farther out, anchoring the Marine side of the line, and listened. Not for footsteps, for breathing. The runner with him was scared enough to make noise. The advisor was trying not to. That told me more than the blood did. There was blood, too. Dark flecks on leaves, a handprint low on the drum, and once in the mud, a thin streak with bubbles in it. Not much, just enough. Airway irritation, maybe a lung clip, maybe smoke and dust turning a manageable wound into a clock. A gunfight would still favor him. He knew our angles. He knew my habits. Fine. Then I would stop playing to his strengths. I emptied what was left of my med kit into the mud beside me and took inventory by feel. Gauze, tape, crushed packaging, one airway syringe cap, a roll of cling wrap half soaked through. Useless? Useless. Maybe useless. Then I found the respiratory ampule case tucked against the inner seam, intact because the world had apparently decided not to be completely hateful. Not a miracle, not a weapon anybody sane would choose first. Just one more tool for manipulating a body that had already started betraying its owner. I leaned close to Harrison so the plan didn't have to travel far. Smoke him from the left, CS on the back edge. He'll protect the good lung and turn right. Harrison didn't waste time asking for a lecture. And then I palmed the flashbang and watched the clearing through the knot of roots. Then he blinks exactly where I need him. Cole heard enough over the net to understand his part. His reply came back flat. All marine bark shaved down to function. Team's ready. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the darkening brush, the runner coughed once. The advisor didn't. That was discipline, and it was also strain. Men who could breathe normally did not hold that still for that long. I cracked the ampule against the fuel drum beside me and let the harsh medicated sting mix with the damp air, then slid it into the weeds where the smoke would carry it low. The first canister hissed, and the clearing changed shape. Smoke rolled along the ground in dirty folds. Then the CS hit behind it and turned the whole low pocket vicious. The burn reached us even from cover, bitter enough to claw the back of the throat and make the eyes want to flood. Somebody deeper in the trees shouted. Then came the reaction I had been waiting for. Not a dramatic collapse, just a ragged break in the rhythm. One cough, then another, uglier. The kind that tore upward from a chest already fighting for room. The runner broke first, stumbling out of the brush half-blind with his rifle too low, and Cole's team put him flat without killing him. The advisor stayed hidden 1 second longer, which was exactly what a man like him would do. Then instinct beat doctrine. He pivoted away from the gas, turning his body to guard the side that hurt most, and that tiny protective twist exposed the lane to his right. I threw the flashbang into it and looked away before it popped. The blast punched the clearing white. Sound went from helicopter loud to nothing, and back again in one brutal wave that slammed my teeth together and left the world ringing like struck glass. I moved through that ring with the M4 down, not up, because the point was never to outdraw him. He was on one knee when I reached him, coughing, blind, one hand clawed at his headset, the other still trying to drag the tablet case tight against his chest. He raised the rifle by reflex. I kicked it sideways into the mud and drove him flat with the stock across his forearm before he could find the trigger. He hit the ground hard and kept fighting in the quiet, disciplined way professionals did when they knew yelling was wasted oxygen. No villain speech, no confession, just breath, blood, and stubbornness. I stripped the tablet case free and rolled him far enough to zip cuff his wrists while Harrison's people closed the circle. The case was warm from his body and slick with sweat. Inside sat the thing that had moved half the story without ever firing a round. Routing extracts, authorization echoes, cross-linked access logs, and one buried thread tying the route change to a sanitized advisory channel that should have been dead on paper years ago. Artifact secured. Leak path identified. Shut the channel, close the wound. Easy to say. Harder part came a breath later, when Harrison pushed onto the open command net for chain of custody and used my full operational identity because there was no clean way around it anymore. Not Corman, not cover. The real box. The real compartment. JAG would hear it. Cole would hear it. Every recorder worth a damn would hear it. The advisor lay in the mud, blinking through tears and chemical burn, while the evidence that could close the leak sat in my hands. We had the proof. We had the man. We had also just burned the last scrap of deniability I had left. The Admiral slapped the memo down hard enough to make the water glass jump. It was a cheap sound for a very expensive room, paper hitting steel like the system wanted. One last reminder that it could still turn trees, blood, helicopters, dead routes, and missing men into something cold and rectangular. Night had settled outside the command building, black glass and floodlights, and a flight line humming somewhere beyond the walls. Inside, the air was too clean, conditioned, filtered. It smelled like copier, toner, stale coffee, and the kind of carpet that had soaked up 30 years of restrained panic. I stood at parade rest because sitting would have made this feel like a negotiation, and it wasn't one. The new ROE memo sat between us in a neat stack, clipped and tabbed, and surgically specific. Future direct action authority restricted. Embedded override, authority curtailed. Independent mission shaping suspended pending review. The corporate language for your leash is ready, ma'am. The Admiral's face gave nothing away, except fatigue and irritation in unequal parts. He was not here to thank me. He was here to contain a fire, without admitting the building had been poorly wired in the first place. Across the room, Cole stood with his doctrine log tucked under one arm, shoulders squared, eyes forward, looking like the human form of an after-action report. The artifact from the extraction point had done exactly what evidence was supposed to do and exactly what institutions hated. It proved enough to act and not enough to cleanly confess. The advisory channel had been burned, the compromised route authority sealed, the captured logs transferred to compartments so narrow they might as well have been veins. The ex-U.S. advisor was alive under guard, which meant lawyers, interrogators, and several varieties of ambitious coward would now take turns pretending they had built the case themselves. None of that changed the document on the desk. The Admiral tapped it once, with 2 fingers, not dramatic, just precise. Your actions saved Marines and prevented a broader weapons transfer, he said. Then the correction came, because it always did. Your actions also created a command exposure I am now required to manage. There it was, cost with the receipt attached. Harrison leaned against the far wall with his arms folded, expression unreadable in the way seasoned men practiced until it became permanent. Webb stood beside him, looking like he wanted to grin and knew better. The only sound for a second was the low hum of the ventilation and a printer somewhere outside the office spitting out some other poor bastard's destiny. I reached for the memo, and the paper felt cool, almost damp with air conditioning, smooth and impersonal against the calluses in my fingertips. Cole stepped forward when the Admiral asked for his record. He didn't embellish, didn't grandstand, just read from the log in that clipped, gruff voice of his, each line a fence post hammered into the ground. Unauthorized channel access under fire. Protest entered contemporaneously. Positive survival outcome. JAG memo. Screenshot observed. Routing discrepancy preserved. He gave the facts the way Marines gave honors at funerals, straight-backed and without trying to improve the dead. When he finished, he closed the log and looked at me for half a beat longer than rank strictly required. Not apology, not approval. Respect had finally made it through customs, but it had arrived carrying its own paperwork. The Admiral slid the memo another inch across the desk. You will remain operational, he said. You will not remain unconstrained. That was the bargain then. Keep the weapon, lock the box, save the body, restrict the hand. System logic. Ugly, but not irrational. I read the lines again, every one of them. Another little wall built around motion I used to take for granted. Somewhere in the middle of it, I felt a smile, trying to happen, and let it. Dry, brief, no humor in it except the kind that kept people from breaking into smaller pieces. Nice cage, I said. Harrison looked down to hide the corner of his mouth. Webb failed completely and coughed into one fist. I signed because not signing would have been theater, and I was tired of theater for one lifetime. The pen scratched. The paper slid back across the desk. The Admiral gathered the memo with the careful hands of a man filing away something dangerous but useful. Meeting over. No medals. No applause. No hollow speech about exceptional valor. Just fluorescent light, official ink, and the sound of a system stitching itself closed around the wound without ever admitting how deep it had run. Cole moved aside to let me pass, then gave one short nod. Clean, professional. Enough. I returned it and kept walking until I reached the outer corridor where the night air leaked in each time the security door opened. My hand brushed the rail by the steps on the way out, more habit than intention. I stopped there, under the wash of sodium light, and looked down at it. No tremor, not even a whisper. The fingers were steady at last, quiet after all the gunfire and rotor wash and paperwork and blood. That should have felt like victory. It didn't. It felt like a bill that had finally been paid in full. I stood there a moment longer, smiling that same thin gallows smile at nothing and nobody, and flexed my hand once in the yellow light. The cage was real. So was the stillness.